हेलो एवरीवन, वेलकम टू माय यूट्यूब चैनल द सोलफुल डायरी। आज की वीडियो में हम बात करेंगे जेन ऑस्टन की नॉवल प्राइड एंड प्रेजुडिस के बारे में। प्राइड एंड प्रेजुडिस को इन डेप्थ जानने से पहले जान लेते हैं जेन ऑस्टन के लाइफ के बारे में। Jane Austen was born on 17 December 1775 at Steventon in Hampshire. Jane was the youngest but one of the family, her only sister Cassandra being 2 years older. They were evidently a lively, clever, good humored group of young people. Some of the games and sports of the youth survived to show that they naturally took to games of wit, which both mother and father gave them a lead. No doubt, Jane had made many an actual game in her mind when she described the game of speculation in Mansfield Park. Jane Austen's was mainly home education. As a small child, she was sent to school at Oxford with her sister Cassandra, chiefly because she could not have borne separation from her. The two little girls moved with the school to Southampton where Jane nearly died of a putrid fever. After this, the sisters were taken home, but later on, they spent 2 pleasant years at the Abbey School, reading probably. However, the most valuable education that Jane imbibed was in her own home. At Steventon, she produced a short one act play on a contemporary romantic novel called Love and Relationship. Jane Austen's illness came to be regarded in the family as decline. In May 1817, she and Cassandra moved into Winchester in order to have more expert medical advice. Jane Austen's was an uneventful, full life, passed largely in such countryside activities as dancing, social visiting, tea making, playing country games, and occasional theatricals. Her pictures are made up of the trivialities of life in a small country town, when tea time was an exciting event and a subscription ball a crisis in one's career, when romance expressed itself in country walks, usually with the chairperson, when tragedy hinged upon the non appearance at the crossroads of the agreeable young man who danced so well at the ball. Faithful observation, personal detachment, and fine sense of ironic comedy are among Jane Austen's chief characteristics as a writer. List of some of her important novels are Sense and Sensibility. The first draft was written about the year 1792 in a form of letters under the title Eleanor and Marianne, and it was finally published in 1811. Pride and Prejudice, first written in 1796 to 97 under the title First Impressions, it was published in 1831. Northanger Abbey, first written about the year 1798, reversed in 8103 and sold to a bookseller in Bath who did not publish it. After the appearance of the first novel, Henry Austen bought it back for the same price. Published after Jane Austen's death with Persuasion in 1818. Mansfield Park, written during 1812 to 14, published in 1814. Emma, written in 1814-15, published late in 1815, although the date of publication of the title page is 1816. Persuasion began after Emma was finished, completed in August 1816, published with Northanger Abbey in 1818. Some of the main characteristics of Jane Austen's novel are they are limited to the rural side, to middle and upper classes, to a single theme, to social conduct and social relationships, to the surface of life, to the exclusion of passion, to the woman's point of view, to the satiric viewpoint, to the observations of life, to the exclusion of social or philosophical discussion, and to present reality as contrasted with idealism or high aspirations. चलिए अब समरी को डिस्कस करते हैं। प्राइड एंड प्रेजुडिस डील्स विद द लाइफ ऑफ 2 or 3 middle class families living in a provincial town. Mr. and Mrs. Bennet lived with their five daughters in Longbourn, a village in Hertfordshire. Mr. Bennet, the head of the family, a strange mixture of sarcastic humor and reserve, was quiet and studious by nature. Mrs. Bennet was rather a foolish woman of uncertain temper. She was keen to see her daughters well married. Jane, the eldest daughter, was beautiful, while Elizabeth, who came next to Jane, was not so beautiful, but she was sensible and quick witted. She was keen observer of men and manners and did not like any hypocrisy. The other daughters were not so intelligent and accomplished. Mary was fond of reading, and Catherine and Lydia spent their time in frivolous pleasures. One day, Mrs. Bennet informed her husband that a rich young man named Bingley had come to live in their neighborhood at Netherfield Park. She thought him a good match for one of their daughters. Mr. Bennet and her daughters met Mr. Bingley soon after at a ball. Mr. Bingley came there with Mr. Darcy, his friend, Mr. Hurst, his brother in law, Mrs. Hurst, and Miss Bingley, his two sisters. Both Mr. Bingley and Darcy were unmarried and had pleasing manners. Both Mrs. Hurst and Mr. Bingley were also fine women. Mr. Darcy soon attracted attention by his fine, handsome features and by the reports that he was a rich man with 10,000 a year. But he was soon found to be proud. He declined to dance, for there was none good enough to be a partner for him. Elizabeth was not beautiful enough for him, and Jane, who was certainly beautiful, had already been chosen by Bingley. After the ball, Jane and Elizabeth talked about Mr. Bingley and Darcy. Jane was all praises for Bingley. Elizabeth agreed with her sister. She did not like Darcy. Sir William Lucas had formerly entered in Marton, where he had earned well and was knighted by the king. He had subsequently given up business and shifted with his family to a house about a mile from Meryton. The house was named Lucas Lodge. Mrs. Bennet, with her daughter, soon visited the Bingleys at Netherfield. Mrs. Hurst and Miss Bingley found the mother to be intolerable and the younger sisters not worth speaking to. However, they desired to be better acquainted with Jane and Elizabeth. Darcy's opinion about Elizabeth too began to change. At first, he had looked at her without admiration, but soon he found that her face was rendered uncommonly intelligent by the beautiful expression of her dark eyes. He was also forced to acknowledge that her figure was graceful, and though her manners were not those of the fashionable world, he was caught by her charming simplicity. Sir William Lucas had been formerly in trade in Meryton, where he had earned well and was knighted by the king. He had subsequently given up business and shifted with his family to a house about a mile from Meryton. The house was named Lucas Lodge. Mrs. Bennet, with her daughter, soon visited the Bingleys at Netherfield. Mrs. Hurst and Miss Bingley found the mother to be intolerable and the younger sisters not worth speaking to. However, they desired to be better acquainted with Jane and Elizabeth. Darcy's opinion about Elizabeth too began to change. At first, he had looked at her without admiration, but soon he found that her face was rendered uncommonly intelligent by the beautiful expression of her dark eyes. He was also forced to acknowledge that her figure was graceful, and though her manners were not those of the fashionable world, he was caught by her charming simplicity. Mr. Bennet had a sister married to Mr. Phillips, an attorney who lived at Meryton. Catherine and Lydia frequently visited their uncle and aunt. One day, Jane received an invitation from Miss Bingley to dine at Netherfield. Miss Bingley mentioned in her letter that her brother and Darcy had gone to Meryton and were not likely to return till late in the night. Elizabeth knew when to talk and when to be silent, and her remarks were always intelligent. The result was that Darcy began to observe her with greater interest and noticed her fine qualities. She often noticed that his eyes were fixed on her. Darcy was pleased to know that Jane and Elizabeth were about to return to Longbourn, and for Elizabeth had been at Netherfield long enough. She had attracted him more than he liked, and Miss Bingley had been rude to her. He resolved that no sign or word of admiration should escape him, nothing that could make her feel that he loved her. Next morning, Jane and Elizabeth returned to Longbourn. Mrs. Bennet was not pleased to see them back so early, but their father, who was more sensible, was pleased with their return. Mr. Collins proved to be an odd character. He was never tired of praising his patroness, Lady Catherine de Bourgh. Mrs. Bennet was greatly pleased to know that matrimonial intentions of Mr. Collins. In her opinion, Elizabeth could never hope to get a better husband than Mr. Collins. Soon after his arrival at Longbourn, Mr. Collins went with the Bennet sisters of Meryton. Their leader met an officer of acquaintance called Danny. Next day, the Bennet sisters and Mr. Collins attended a party given by Mrs. Phillips. Darcy's father wanted to educate him for the church, but owing to the intrigues of Darcy, the plan could not be carried out and he was driven to join the army. Wickham narrated his story with such apparent truth that Elizabeth could not help believing it. With his pleasant manners, Wickham won everybody's good opinion, and this increased Elizabeth's own regard for him. On reaching Longbourn, Elizabeth learned that Mr. Bennet had already gone to London in search of Lydia. Mrs. Bennet was ill owing to the shock of Lydia's elopement and the disgrace it meant for the family. Mr. Gardiner proceeded to London to help his brother in law in his search. They were sure that Lydia and Wickham must have been hiding somewhere in London. Wickham and Lydia were duly married. It was with great difficulty that Mr. Bennet was persuaded to allow Lydia and Wickham to visit them after their marriage. When they came, they were cordially received by Mrs. Bennet and coolly by Mr. Bennet. Lydia showed no trace of repentance. She was frivolous as usual. Likewise, there was no change in Wickham. In due course, Lydia told them that Darcy was present at her marriage. Elizabeth was greatly surprised to hear it, and she wrote a letter to her aunt to find out how Darcy came to be present at the marriage of Lydia and Wickham. The reply she received from her aunt astonished her still further. Mr. Darcy played an extremely noble part in the Lydia Wickham affair. He came down into London, searched out Lydia and Wickham, and compelled Wickham to marry Lydia. Not only that, he also settled a considerable sum on Wickham, purchased his commission in the army, and paid off all his debts. All this was done to persuade him to marry Lydia. Having stayed at Longbourn for a week, Lydia and Wickham went to the north where Wickham's regiment was stationed. Mrs. Bennet was satisfied, for at least one of her daughters was married. News was now received that Mr. Bingley was coming again to Netherfield. This news made Mrs. Bennet hope again that he might yet marry Jane. Soon after their arrival, Bingley, accompanied by Darcy, caught at Longbourn. It was not long before Elizabeth could judge that he still loved Jane, and he had paid a visit to them on account of her, but she was not sure if Darcy still loved her, for he was silent as ever. Mr. Bingley visited the Bennets almost every day. At last, one day, he proposed to Jane and was accepted. Mrs. Bennet was delighted that one more of her daughter was soon to be married. About a week after Bingley's engagement with Jane, as they were sitting on one morning in the parlour, Lady Catherine came to them. Mr. Bennet and her daughters were much surprised to see their visitor. Lady Catherine sat in a room for some time and then asked Elizabeth to accompany her outside. When they were alone, Lady Catherine told Elizabeth insolently that she had heard that she and her nephew Darcy intended to marry, and that she had come to Longbourn with the purpose of breaking off their engagement, for it was settled long ago that Darcy would marry her daughter. Elizabeth replied that if Darcy was really engaged to Miss de Bourgh, he could not possibly be engaged to her. Therefore, Lady Catherine asked her to promise that she would never marry Darcy. Elizabeth refused to give any such promise. The result was that Lady Catherine left her in great anger, holding out dire threats to her. Elizabeth was afraid that Lady Catherine would succeed in influencing her nephew against her, but to her great surprise, Darcy came to their home with Bingley a few days after the lady's visit. Darcy and Elizabeth went out for a long walk, and during the walk, Darcy proposed to Elizabeth. This time, Elizabeth accepted his proposal still gratefully. Mr. Bennet was at first surprised to hear of their engagement, for he was under the impression that Elizabeth did not like Darcy. But when Elizabeth assured him that Darcy was a good man and that she loved him, he gladly gave him his consent. Mrs. Bennet's joy knew no bounds, for Elizabeth was to marry such a rich man. She had never dreamt of such good fortune. Elizabeth Bennet. Elizabeth Bennet, the chief figure in Pride and Prejudice, is one of the most fascinating heroines of Jane Austen. Darcy considers her a plain girl and does not like to dance with her, but gradually he is forced to acknowledge that she has considerable physical charms. In course time, he finds that she has a figure light and pleasing, and that she has perfect symmetry of form. She has bewitching eyes, which are the very pole and axis of her personality. It is the qualities of her mind and heart which makes her such a fascinating personality. She is one of the cleverest and liveliest uh, character in this story. She is intelligent and self-respecting. She is always dignified. She overhears Darcy calling her just tolerable and not good enough to dance with him. She is an intelligent girl who at once sees through a character or situation. She is never impressed by mere compliments. As a matter of fact, she is a keen student of human nature, its follies and foibles. Elizabeth is witty, and her wit is an expression of her intelligence and her understanding of human life. Her sanity and prudence are seen in the fact that she is not petty minded and materialistic like her mother or like her friend Charlotte Lucas. She was prejudiced against Darcy and considered him proud and the author of untold wrongs to Wickham and her sister. But by the end of the novel, she has to acknowledge that her prejudice was baseless and that Darcy is a perfect gentleman in every way worthy of her love. Thus, Elizabeth is a rounded, dynamic character. She is not static or wooden. She develops and grows and captivates the heart of the reader by her manifold charms. Jane Bennet. Jane Bennet is the eldest of the five Bennet sisters. We are told that she was extremely good looking, much more than Elizabeth, and the fact that Bingley falls in love with her almost at first sight is an adequate testimony to her good looks. She's simple, saintly character, and Jane Bennet is not an intricate character. She does not have the intelligence and the wit of Elizabeth. She is not a shrewd judge of human nature. She is incapable of thinking ill of anyone. She is deceived by first appearances. She puts a favorable interpretation of the actions of others even when no such interpretation is justified. She likes all without distinction, does not find fault with anyone, and even when she criticizes, she does not so in the mildest possible words. She is not a girl of ardent passions. Her love is not demonstrative. She loves Bingley deeply and devotedly, and the depth of her love is seen in the fact that she cherishes his memory even when it is supposed that he has jilted her. Her nature lacks the warmth of response and the fire of passion. She is a very patient and self effacing girl. As a result of the neglect of Bingley, she suffers deeply and intensely, but not a word of complaint, not a murmur escapes her lip. Her suffering is unimaginable. Her faith in Bingley remained unshaken, and her suffering was long and deep, but she bore it with the greatest patience. Her patient forbearance is ultimately rewarded. Mrs. Bennet. Mrs. Bennet has been described by the novelist as a woman of weak understanding, little information, and uncertain temper. When frustrated, she considered herself nervous. The business of her life is to get her daughters married. Its solace is visiting and news. She's mean, narrow minded, she's coarse and refined, she's noisy and makes fuss over trifles. By her ill breeding, she offends everybody. The Bingleys form a poor opinion of her, and so does Darcy. She is the daughter of an unhumble attorney of Meryton, and as such has received little education. She has travelled little and has been confined all her life to the narrow Longbourn circle. The one business of her life is husband hunting. She has five daughters of marriageable age and she wants to get them married by fair means or foul. Mrs. Bennet is worldly minded, greedy and jealous. Worldly wealth, rank, and position are everything for her. The Mrs. Bennet is stupid, vulgar, coarse, petty minded, greedy, and selfish woman. In life, she might disgust and bore us, but in the page of Jane Austen, she simply delights and amuses us. Lady Catherine de Bourgh. Lady Catherine, the rich lady of Rosings, by the foolish Mr. Collins, he is all praises for her generosity and kindness. Actually, when we first meet her during Elizabeth's visit to Hunsford, we find that she is arrogant, proud, impudent, and bad mannered. She's tall and rather large lady who must have been good looking in her youth. Her wealth, rank, and position, and the flattery of people like Mr. Collins, with whom she is surrounded, have made her vain and conceited. She is impudent, arrogant, and has no regard for the feelings of others. Intoxicated with wealth, she invites her to come daily to her place to practice on the piano in the room of the governess. Darcy. Darcy is one of the most complex and intricate characters ever created by Jane Austen. It must be acknowledged that Darcy at the beginning of the story is rather proud. His excessive pride renders him most objectionable to those whom he does not consider to be his equals, and it leads him to conduct himself in a most ungentle, manly manner. The story of the novel mainly consists in the shedding of Darcy's pride under the influence of love. He is fascinated by Elizabeth from the moment he is introduced to her, but at the same time he recognizes the impossibility of giving way to his passion owing to her inferior social status. He proposes to Elizabeth at Longbourn and is accepted. He freely admits the insults he had offered to Elizabeth on the occasion of his first proposal, and indeed his very readiness to marry into a family that had been put to such shame shows that his pride has been shed. His pride, however, as Wickham points out, is the cause of many of his acts of generosity. It has taught him to be honorable, just and upright, and most thorough in everything he did. When he took up Lydia's case, he did everything that was possible for him to do. Not only did he compel Wickham to marry her, but he also procured for him a commission in the army. Thus, there is plenty of good in Darcy's character. It is only his pride in his rank and wealth which obscure his better qualities in the beginning and make him so objectionable to Elizabeth and others. Collins. He is vastly stupid and vastly funny. He was extremely foolish by nature and there was no good home influences to improve him. His father always treated him with great severity and consequently we find him most servile to people whose position is superior to his own. The novelist has summed up this funny character as a mixture of pride, self-importance, and humility. He was exceedingly proud of his position as a clergyman and was constantly referring to it in season and out of season. To Lady Catherine he was always servile, and though she always treated him as a servant, his nature was so contemptible and mean that he felt flattered by any she might give him, no matter how rudely worded it might be. His foolishness has made him entirely dull and insensitive. He could not see the sarcasm in Mr. Bennet's remarks, and the broad hints or the letter were quite thrown away on him at the end of his first visit to Longbourn. The letters he writes to the Bennets after the elopement of Lydia reveals his nature. It is intended to be a letter of condolence. In it, he informs Mr. Bennet that he has told all the details of Lydia's elopement to Lady Catherine, who quite agreed with him that the family would be disgraced in consequence. A good instance of his foolishness is seen in the compliments he is in the habit of composing and subsequently paying to Lady Catherine. Owing to his never ending having had any opportunity of moving in polished society, we find him ever conducting himself in an extremely servile manner. His meanness is well illustrated by his behavior towards Elizabeth after he had rejected his suit. On the occasion, the only reason for his mortification was that his vanity was hurt. We never, whenever Mr. Collins appears on the scene, he makes us laugh, and we can safely say that without him, much of the amusement of the novel would have been lost. Others, like Darcy, may change and grow, but Mr. Collins remain fixed in his straight. Bingley. Bingley is a good-natured, unaffected, easygoing person. He's a rich man who can go through life without facing any problems, but he is without pride or conceit and is in every way a contrast to Darcy. The difference between the two is well brought out by their reactions to the Meryton people. Bingley has come across no pleasanter people or prettier girls in his life. He meets them without formality or pride and soon gets acquainted with everyone present. Jane Bennet he looks upon as an angel. Darcy, on the other hand, has moved in high fashionable society, so he finds Merton people unfashionable, uninteresting, countrified, from whom he derives no pleasure. He considers that Jane Bennet is good looking, but she smiles too much, and that Elizabeth is just tolerable. Bingley seems to be devoid of the critical faculty possessed by Darcy, for he has never noticed any of the vulgarities of the Bennet family, although his sister were constantly reminding him of those vulgarities. He is not a man of deep feeling. He is not even an ardent lover. Otherwise, he would not have been so easily persuaded by Darcy to give up the idea of marrying Jane Bennet. In short, he is a suitable counterpart to the gentle and saintly Jane. Mr. Bennet is a satirical onlooker in the game of life. A good instance of his sarcasm is provided by his interview with Elizabeth after her refusal to marry Mr. Collins. The only occasion in the novel which he seems to be somewhat serious is when he refuses to admit Lydia to the house after she had disgraced the family. He seems to be lazy and indolent, a man who has never tried to make any provision for his family or take to any profession to support them. He is a man of the keenest intelligence and has plenty of ability, so that he would no doubt have succeeded well in whatever he would have taken up. But he does not do anything and is satisfied with his 2,000 a year. Domestic unhappiness has made him frustrated, and he seeks compensation in observing and ridiculing the follies of others. For what do we live, says he to Elizabeth, but to make sport for our neighbors and laugh at them in our turn? He looks upon even his own family with the same sarcastic eye as he casts upon the world in general, and the follies of his family give him as much amusement as those of other people. It causes him pain or annoyance to see his family make themselves ridiculous. He tries to hide it under the cover of raillery and banter. At the Bingley's ball, he enjoys thoroughly their good action, although he must have seen that they were being ridiculed by the Bingley sisters. He is a negligent father. This is the greatest fault. It is a wonder that Jane and Elizabeth grow up as they do with such a father and such a childish mother. He is fond only of Elizabeth and takes little interest in the rest of the family. Themes: Love. Pride and Prejudice contains one of the most cherished love stories in English literature, the courtship between Darcy and Elizabeth. As in any good love story, the lovers must elude and overcome numerous stumbling blocks, beginning with the tensions caused by the lover's own personal qualities. Elizabeth's pride makes her misjudge Darcy on the basis of a poor first impression, while Darcy's prejudice against Elizabeth's poor social standing blinds him, for a time, to her many virtues. Of course, one could say that Elizabeth is guilty of prejudice and Darcy of pride. The title cuts both ways. Uh, they both uh, uh, go through smaller obstacles to the realization of the love between Elizabeth and Darcy, including Lady Catherine's attempt to control her nephew, Miss Bingley's snobbery, Mrs. Bennet's idiocy, and Wickham's deceit. In each case, anxieties about social connections or the desire for better social connections interfere with the workings of love. Darcy and Elizabeth's realization of a mutual and tender love seems to imply that Austen views love as something independent of these social forces, as something that can be captured if only an individual is able to escape the warping effects of a hierarchical society. Austen does sound some more realist, or one could say cynical, notes about love, using the character of Charlotte Lucas, who marries the buffoon Mr. Collins for his money, to demonstrate that the heart does not always dictate marriage. Yet, with her central characters, Austen suggests that true love is a force separate from society and one that can conquer even the most difficult of circumstances. Reputation, Pride and Prejudice depicts a society in which a woman's reputation is of the utmost importance. A woman is expected to behave in certain ways. Stepping outside the social norms makes her vulnerable to ostracism. This theme appears in the novel when Elizabeth walks to Netherfield and arrives with muddy skirts. To the shock of the reputation conscious Miss Bingley and her friends, at one point the ill mannered, ridiculous behavior of Mrs. Bennet gives her a bad reputation with the more refined and snobbish Darcys and Bingleys. Austen pokes gentle fun at the snobs in these examples, but later in the novel, when Lydia elopes with Wickham and lives with him without him out of wedlock, the author treats reputation as a very serious matter. By becoming Wickham's lover without benefit of marriage, Lydia clearly places herself outside the social pale, and her disgrace threatens the entire Bennet family. The fact that Lydia's judgment, however terrible, would likely have condemned the other Bennet sisters to marriageless lives seems grossly unfair. Why should Elizabeth's reputation suffer along with Lydia's? Darcy's intervention on the Bennets' behalf thus becomes all the more dangerous. But some readers might reason that such an intervention was necessary at all. If Darcy's money had failed to convince Wickham to marry Lydia, would Darcy have still married Elizabeth? Does his transcendence of prejudice extend that far? The happy ending of Pride and Prejudice is certainly emotional, satisfying, but in many ways it leaves the theme of reputation and the importance placed on reputation unexplored. And then ask of Pride and Prejudice, to what extent does it critique social structures, and to what extent does it simply accept their inevitability? Class. The theme of class is related to reputation, in that both reflect the strictly regimented nature of life for the middle and upper classes in Regency England. The lines of class are strictly drawn, while the Bennets, who are middle class, may socialize with the upper class Bingleys and Darcys. They are clearly their social inferiors and are treated as such. Austen satirizes this kind of class consciousness, particularly in the character of Mr. Collins, who spends most of his time toadying to his upper class patron, Lady Catherine de Bourgh. Though Mr. Collins offers an extreme example, he is not the only one to hold such views, as a conception of the importance of class is shared, among others, by Mr. Darcy, who believes in the dignity of his lineage, Miss Bingley, who dislikes anyone not as socially accepted as she is, and Wickham, who will do anything he can to get enough money to raise himself into a higher station. Mr. Collins' views are merely the most extreme and obvious. The satire directed at Mr. Collins is therefore also more subtly directed at the entire social hierarchy and the conception of all those within it at its correctness, in complete disregard of other more worthy virtues. Though through the Darcy Elizabeth and Bingley Jane marriages, Austen shows the power of love and happiness to overcome class boundaries and prejudices, thereby implying that such prejudices are hollow, unfeeling, and unproductive. Of course, this whole discussion of class must be made with the understanding that Austen herself is often criticized as being a classist. She doesn't really represent any from the lower classes. Those servants she does portray are generally happy with their lot. Austen does criticizes class structure, but only a limited slice of that structure. Family is an integral theme in the novel. All of the characters operate within networks of family connections that shape their decisions and perspectives. For the female characters in particular, the influence and behavior of their family members is a significant factor in their lives, because the business of Mrs. Bennet's life was to get her daughters married. The Bennet sisters constantly have to navigate their mother's plan and schemes, while male characters like Mr. Darcy and Mr. Bingley have much more social and financial independence. They still rely on the judgment and opinions of female family members like Caroline Bingley and Lady Catherine de Bourgh. Individuals are judged according to their behavior or their family members, which is why Darcy points out to Lizzie that he is doing her a favor by proposing, even though she comes with embarrassing family connections. The theme of family shows that individuals never lead totally autonomous lives and that individuals' actions have wider communal implications. Integrity. Elizabeth Bennet considers herself to have very high standards of integrity, and she's often frustrated and disappointed by the way she sees others behaving. She complains bitterly to her sister, "The more I see the world, the more am I dissatisfied with it." And even Day confirms my beliefs of the inconsistency of all human characters. She behaves in ways she considers consistent with her definition of integrity by refusing to marry both Mr. Collins and Mr. Darcy when he proposes the first time. Elizabeth thinks it is very important to only marry a man she loves and respects, despite the pressure to achieve economic security. By the end of the novel, Lizzie's commitment to integrity has been rewarded because she marries a partner who will truly make her happy. She has also come to see that she can sometimes be too rigid and judge too quickly. Since she was initially mistaken about the nature and ethics of Wickham and Darcy, the novel endorses the importance of integrity, but it also reminds readers not to be too quick to pass judgment on who has it and who doesn't. Gender is a key theme in Pride and Prejudice. The story takes place at a time when gender roles were quite rigid, and men and women had a very different set of options and influences. Marriage is a pressing question for female characters like Charlotte Lucas and Bennet sisters, because marriage is the only way a woman can achieve economic stability and autonomy. As upper class women, they would not have been able to work to earn a living or live independently. Marriage offered one of the only ways to move beyond their birth families. However, a woman's marriageability relied on an impeccable reputation for chastity, and for women like Georgina Darcy or Lydia Bennet, a reckless decision to trust the wrong man could permanently ruin their future prospects. Lydia's elopement causes Lizzie to exclaim with horror that she's lost forever. If Lydia is living with Wickham without being married to him, her reputation will be destroyed. Courtship. In a sense, Pride and Prejudice is a story of two courtships, those between Darcy and Elizabeth and between Bingley and Jane. Within this broad structure appears other smaller courtship. Mr. Collins' aborted wooing of Elizabeth, followed by his successful wooing of Charlotte Lucas, Miss Bingley's unsuccessful attempt to attract Darcy, Wickham's pursuit first of Elizabeth, then of never seen Miss King, and finally of Lydia. Courtship therefore takes on a profound, often unspoken importance in the novel. Marriage is the ultimate goal. Courtship constitutes the real working out of love. Courtship becomes a sort of forge of a person's personality, and each courtship becomes a microcosm for different sorts of love or different ways to abuse love as a means to social advancement. Journeys. Nearly every scene in Pride and Prejudice takes place indoors, and the action centers around the Bennet home in the small village of Longbourn. Nevertheless, journeys, even short ones, function repeatedly as catalysts for change in the novel. Elizabeth's first journey, by which she intends simply to visit Charlotte and Mr. Collins, brings her into contact with Mr. Darcy and leads to his first proposal. Her second journey takes her to Derby and Pemberley, where she fans the growing flame of her affection for Darcy. The third journey, meanwhile, sends various people in pursuit of Wickham and Lydia, and the journey ends with Darcy tracking them down and saving the Bennet family honor, in the process demonstrating his continued devotion to Elizabeth. Judgments. Characters' misjudgment of each other based on shallow first impressions drive much of the conflict of the novel. Appropriately, these misjudgments often stem from the character's personal pride or societal prejudices. Most notably, of course, Elizabeth bases her understanding of Mr. Darcy on his initial rudeness because he has injured her pride. She reads the worst possible interpretation into his every action, mistaking his attraction for scorn and instantly believing Wickham's lies. Her misreading of Mr. Darcy's intentions heightens the romantic tension of the novel, while her trust in Wickham, another poor judgment, brings him closer to the Bennet family and therefore Lydia. Mr. Darcy misjudges Jane's feelings towards Mr. Bingley based on the way the Bennet family's behavior bolsters his class-based prejudices, leading him to mistake Jane's shyness for a cold disinterest in Mr. Bingley as a person. His discouragement of the match deepens the rift between him and Elizabeth. However, not only the protagonist demonstrate these lapses in judgment. Mr. Collins, for example, pridefully assumes that his financial security will be enough to woo Elizabeth. Lady Catherine de Bourgh, clouded by both pride and prejudice, does not recognize that it is Mr. Darcy, not Elizabeth, who has initiated their courtship. Symbols. Pemberley. Pemberley, Darcy's estate, sits at the center of the novel, literally and figuratively, as a geographic symbol of the man who owns it. Elizabeth visits it at a time when her feelings towards Darcy are beginning to warm. She is enchanted by its beauty and charm, and by the picturesque countryside, just as she will be charmed increasingly by the gifts of its owner. Austen makes the connection explicit when she describes the stream that flows beside the mansion. In France, she writes, a stream of some natural importance was swelled to greater but without any artificial appearance. Darcy possesses a natural importance that is swelled by his arrogance but which coexists with a genuine honesty and lack of artificial appearance. Darcy possesses a natural importance that is swelled by his arrogance but which coexists with a genuine honesty and lack of artificial appearance. Like the stream, he is neither formal nor falsely adorned. Pemberley even offers a symbol within a symbol for for the budding romance. When Elizabeth encounters Darcy on the estate, she is crossing a small bridge, suggesting the broad gulf of misunderstanding and class prejudice that lies between them and the bridge that their love will build across in marriage. Instead of simply being an expression of love or the creation of a couple marriage, for novels, women characters represent their prospects for the future. In Regency England, women could not hold property, and so after the passing of their father, the Bennet sisters will have to rely on either husbands or male relatives for security. Therefore, marriage for them represents long term stability. While it may be easy to read Mrs. Bennet's excitement over Mr. Bingley's leasing of Netherfield as shallow, she suggests that marrying Mr. Bingley would lead to one of her daughters being established, a word that implies permanent comfort. Charlotte Lucas makes a calculated marriage to Mr. Collins because it will assure her a comfortable life. In contrast, Lydia rushes into marriage with Wickham because she focuses on her strong passion for him without accounting for reputation or financial issues. Elizabeth is considering Lydia's fate, sees little prospect for long-term happiness. Even though Lydia is in moment overjoyed, both Jane and Elizabeth's marriages take into account chemistry with their spouses and financial security, assuring the readers of their future happiness. The outdoors. Outdoor settings in Pride and Prejudice usually signify authenticity and clear judgment. When the characters are indoors, the demands of society, hierarchy, and reputation cloud the characters' judgment, as well as when Elizabeth's first impression of Mr. Darcy. In addition, during Darcy's first proposal, which takes place indoors, he focuses primarily on the challenges to their marriage, such as Elizabeth's lower status and embarrassing family, instead of who he and Elizabeth are as people. Instead of a sincere expression of feeling, these concerns turn Darcy's ridiculous proposal into an insult. In contrast, the outdoors further from societal norms allow characters to see each other for who they really are. For example, when Elizabeth walks the 3 miles to Netherfield, Darcy begins to notice her beauty. Seeing the outdoors grounds of Pemberley helps Elizabeth truly understand Mr. Darcy as a person. Finally, Mr. Darcy's second proposal takes place on a walk around Elizabeth's home. Here, his words focus solely on their feelings towards each other, even though their social circumstances have not changed. Being outside allows for them to clearly see and express themselves to each other, unhindered by society's biases and judgments. थैंक यू। आई होप आज की वीडियो आपको पसंद आई होगी। अगर अच्छी लगी तो लाइक शेयर एंड सब्सक्राइब टू माय चैनल। और अगर आप इस नॉवेल के चैप्टर वाइज समरी चाहते हैं तो कमेंट करके बताएं। और आप आने वाले वीडियोस किस टॉपिक पर देखना चाहते हैं वो भी हमें बताएं। मिलते हैं कल एक और इन्फॉर्मेटिव वीडियो के साथ शाम 4 बजे।